Story 1. The Haunting of Riverdale Road. It was a night in October 2019, crisp and clear, with the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of the car's headlights. My friends and I were stationed in Colorado, serving in the military. Life was routine, punctuated by the occasional thrill of finding something to break the monotony. That particular weekend, we were craving something different, something thrilling. So when one of our friends, a Colorado native, mentioned a haunted road nearby, our interest was piqued. Riverdale Road, he told us, was infamous. It wasn't just a road. It was a place where the fabric of reality was thin, where the past and the present intertwined in the most unsettling ways. The road was home to a multitude of legends, each more disturbing than the last. There was talk of a ghostly jogger, forever running along the road, tapping on car windows and leaving bloody handprints on signs. Others whispered about Native American shapeshifters lurking in the shadows, or ghostly hitchhikers who had vanished the moment they got into a car. But the most terrifying legend of all was that of the Phantom Camaro. The story went that decades ago, in the 1960s or 70s, a man in a black Camaro had been driving too fast down Riverdale Road. The road was notorious for its sharp twists and turns, and it was on one of these bends that the man lost control of his car, crashing into a tree. He died on the spot, his body crushed in the wreckage, his life ending in a flash of twisted metal and flames. Since then, his spirit was said to haunt the road, forever trapped in his Camaro, challenging unsuspecting drivers to a race. The legend was clear. If you tried to outrun the Phantom Camaro, you'd lose your life. My friend, who had grown up hearing these stories, had driven down Riverdale Road several times, but had never encountered anything unusual. However, with Halloween approaching, the rest of us were eager for a scare. So we decided to take a drive down the haunted road in the dead of night, hoping to experience something otherworldly. It was a Sunday night, or technically Monday morning, around a.m. The air was cold, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and sinks into your bones. The five of us piled into my friend's car, a beat-up old sedan that had seen better days. We set off, the only sound the low hum of the engine, as we drove through the empty streets, our destination shrouded in darkness and mystery. As we turned onto Riverdale Road, the atmosphere shifted. The trees lining the road seemed to close in on us, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The road twisted and turned, each bend sharper than the last, the headlights cutting through the darkness in narrow beams. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant cry of a night bird. My friend, the one who had suggested this little adventure, mentioned that he knew a spot along the road where a cross had been placed in memory of a high school acquaintance who had died in a crash. It seemed fitting to stop there, to pay our respects to the dead, and perhaps to see if the road would reveal any of its secrets to us. We pulled over, the car rolling to a stop on the gravel shoulder. As we stepped out, the cold air hit us like a wall, the night suddenly feeling much darker and more foreboding. The cross stood by the side of the road, a simple wooden marker adorned with weathered flowers and a faded photograph. It was a stark reminder of the fragility of life on this dangerous road. While a couple of the guys went off to relieve themselves in the bushes, the rest of us gathered around the cross. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every sound, every crunch of gravel underfoot, every breath, every heartbeat. We stood there in silence, lost in our thoughts, when suddenly the silence was shattered by the sound of an engine roaring to life. The noise was sudden, jarring, as if the car had appeared out of nowhere. We turned, and there it was, a car speeding down the road, its headlights piercing the darkness. It was moving fast, and as it approached, we saw the sleek black outline of a Camaro. For a moment, Time seemed too slow. The car shot past us, a blur of motion and sound, the roar of the engine echoing in the night. As it passed, we caught a glimpse of the taillights red, glowing, and unmistakably belonging to a Camaro. My friend, his voice a mix of nervous laughter and disbelief, muttered, "That must be the Phantom Camaro." We all laughed, but it was a laugh tinged with unease. The car had come out of nowhere, as if summoned by the very mention of the legend. And just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. But the unease lingered, a cold knot of fear twisting in the pit of my stomach. We scrambled back into the car, the thrill of the adventure giving way to a growing sense of dread. As we pulled back onto the road, the darkness seemed to close in even tighter, the trees pressing in on either side like a tunnel. The road stretched out before us, endless and ominous, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then, without warning, the Camaro was back. This time, it was right behind us, its headlights off, its presence an ominous shadow in the rearview mirror. My friend, now visibly shaken, kept his eyes glued to the road ahead. "Don't speed," someone whispered, and we all knew why. The legend was clear: if you tried to outrun the Phantom Camaro, you would lose, and the cost would be your life. We crept along the road, the speedometer barely touching the limit, with the Camaro following us, its presence heavy and oppressive. The tension in the car was palpable. No one spoke. We barely even breathed. Every turn of the wheel felt like a negotiation with death. The road seemed endless, every shadow playing tricks on our minds, every gust of wind sounding like a whisper of doom. As we drove, the air inside the car grew colder, the windows fogging up from the collective breaths of 5 terrified souls. The trees outside seemed to warp and twist in the darkness, their branches clawing at the sky like the hands of the damned. The Camaro stayed right on our tail, its headlights still off, its engine a low, menacing growl. Finally, we reached the end of Riverdale Road, where it met a larger highway. As we turned onto the main road, the Camaro abruptly stopped, as if an invisible barrier had been reached. We watched in stunned silence as it turned around and disappeared back into the night, leaving us shaken and bewildered. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the rapid beating of our hearts and the soft hum of the car engine. Finally, someone broke the silence, voice trembling. "What the hell was that?" We never did figure out what we had encountered that night. Was it truly the Phantom Camaro, or just some deranged driver playing a cruel prank? The questions haunted us long after the night had passed, but one thing was certain: we had come dangerously close to something we could not explain, something that lived in the shadows of Riverdale Road. Days turned into weeks, and the memory of that night should have faded, but it didn't. Instead, it lingered, a dark cloud hanging over us, a constant reminder of the unknown terror we had faced. My friends and I spoke of it rarely, each of us preferring to bury the memory rather than confront it. But the nightmares continued, vivid and terrifying. In my dreams, I was back on Riverdale Road, the Camaro's headlights blinding as it raced toward me. I could hear the roar of the engine, feel the cold air whipping against my face, but no matter how fast I ran, the car always caught up. The impact never came, but the fear was real, waking me in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just the nightmares that haunted me. Strange things began to happen, little things at first: misplaced objects, odd noises in the night, the feeling of being watched. But then the sightings began. It started with a flash of black in the corner of my eye, the fleeting image of a car that vanished when I turned to look. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the lingering effects of that terrifying night. But deep down, I knew it was something more. One night, As I was driving home from the base, I saw it again. The road was empty, the darkness thick around me, and then, in my rearview mirror, I saw the unmistakable shape of a black Camaro. It was distant at first, just a pair of headlights in the darkness, but as I drove, it drew closer, gaining on me with every passing second. Panic set in. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with fear, as I tried to keep calm, to convince myself that it was just another car, that it wasn't what I thought it was. But as it closed the distance, my resolve crumbled. The Camaro was there, right behind me, its headlights off, its engine a low, threatening growl. I kept my speed steady, remembering the legend, knowing that if I sped up, it could be the end. The road seemed to stretch on forever, an endless ribbon of asphalt leading me deeper into the night. My heart raced, my breaths coming in short, shallow gasps as the Camaro stayed on my tail, matching my every move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment, it was there, a menacing presence in my rearview mirror, and the next, it had vanished, leaving me alone on the dark, empty road. I pulled over, my hands shaking, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. The phantom Camaro, it seemed, wasn't confined to Riverdale Road. It had followed me, haunted me, its presence a dark shadow that loomed over my life. I began to fear the night, the darkness, the open road, always wondering if the Camaro would appear again, if it would be the last time I ever saw it. I wasn't the only one who was affected. My friends, too, reported strange occurrences, unexplained noises, flickering lights, the feeling of being followed. One of them, unable to cope with the constant fear, left the base, moving far away from Colorado, hoping to leave the haunting behind. But no matter how far we ran, the memory of that night and the terror it had brought into our lives remained. In the end, we were all changed by that night on Riverdale Road. The experience left a scar, a mark that would never fully heal. The phantom Camaro was more than just a ghost story. It was a reminder of the thin line between life and death, a line that we had all come perilously close to crossing. Even now, years later, I can still hear the roar of that engine in my nightmares, still see those red taillights disappearing into the night. Riverdale Road may be just a stretch of asphalt, but it is also a place where the past and present collide, where the dead do not rest, and where the living are haunted by the memories of what they have seen. And so, as the years pass and the legends of Riverdale Road continue to grow, one thing is certain: the phantom Camaro will always be out there, waiting in the darkness, challenging the brave and the foolish alike to race with death. Story 2: The Hitchhiker's Nightmare. The high desert of California is a place of harsh contrasts. By day, the sun bakes the earth, turning it into a cracked, arid wasteland where life seems to hang on by the thinnest of threads. By night, the temperature plummets, and the darkness brings with it a chilling silence that feels almost unnatural. It was in this unforgiving landscape that I grew up, in a small town called Felon, where the streets were wide and empty, and the nearest neighbor was often miles away. In 2007, I was a senior in high school, counting down the days until I could leave this desolate place behind. My life was simple, revolving around school, my girlfriend, and the long stretches of highway that connected us. My girlfriend lived in Wrightwood, a small town nestled in the San Gabriel Mountains, and to see her, I had to cross two highways, Highway 138 and Highway 2. My mom worked long hours, so getting a ride was out of the question. Instead, I often hitched a ride on my girlfriend's school bus, which dropped me off at her house on Fridays. But getting home was always a challenge. The distance between our houses was about 15 miles, and I had walked it more times than I could count. Over time, I had learned shortcuts through the desert, paths that cut my journey by nearly an hour, though they left me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The desert was a lonely place, where the silence was so thick it felt like a living thing, pressing in on all sides. It was a place where the line between civilization and wilderness blurred, where the only signs of life were the occasional distant howl of a coyote or the rustle of a snake in the brush. One Friday evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I found myself standing at the edge of Wrightwood, looking down the long stretch of road that led back to Fallon. The school bus had dropped me off hours ago, and I had spent the day with my girlfriend, losing track of time as we wandered through the small mountain town. Now the day was fading, and with it, the warmth of the sun. The desert below was already shrouded in shadows, the temperature dropping rapidly as night approached. I knew I had a long walk ahead of me, and I wasn't looking forward to it. The thought of trekking through the desert in the dark, with only the stars to light my way, filled me with a sense of unease. But I had done it before, and I could do it again. So I set off, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the road stretching out before me like a ribbon of asphalt leading into the unknown. As I walked, the air grew colder, the chill seeping through my jacket and into my bones. The desert around me was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of gravel underfoot and the occasional rustle of a breeze through the sparse vegetation. The sky above was a deep, inky black, dotted with countless stars that twinkled like distant beacons in the night. The world felt vast and empty, and I was a tiny speck moving through it, alone and vulnerable. I had been walking for about an hour when I heard a low, rumbling sound that grew louder with each passing second. I turned to see a pair of headlights in the distance, cutting through the darkness as they approached. It was a car, and it was heading straight for me. Relief washed over me. Hitchhiking was common in these parts, and I had done it before without incident. Most of the time, it was a neighbor or a friend's parent who recognized me and offered a ride. The car pulled up beside me, a beat-up red van that had seen better days. The paint was chipped and faded, the windows streaked with dust. The driver rolled down the window, and I peered inside. The man behind the wheel was older, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with a weathered face and tired eyes. His hair was thinning, and he had the look of someone who had spent too much time in the sun, his skin leathery and tanned. "You need a ride?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. I hesitated for a moment, but the thought of walking the rest of the way home in the dark was enough to push aside my reservations. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, opening the door and climbing into the passenger seat. As soon as I shut the door, I regretted it. The inside of the van was cluttered and dirty, with empty cans and fast food wrappers strewn across the floor. The air smelled faintly of sweat and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and unpleasant. The man didn't say anything as he pulled back onto the road, the van lurching forward with a sputter. For the first few minutes, we drove in silence. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the van's suspension as it navigated the uneven road. I glanced over at the driver, noticing the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. There was something off about him, something that set my nerves on edge, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. "So, where you headed?" he finally asked, his voice breaking the silence. "Fallon," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, but didn't say anything else. We continued driving, the van's headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. The farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. The driver kept glancing over at me, his eyes darting back and forth between the road and the passenger seat. There was a nervous energy about him, as if he was on edge, and it was starting to make me feel the same way. After a few more minutes, he spoke again, his voice low and hurried. "You ever heard of a guy named Carlos?" The question caught me off guard. "Carlos," I repeated, confused. "No, I don't think so." The driver nodded again, but there was something in his expression that made me uneasy. "Carlos is a good friend of mine," he said, his voice taking on an almost manic edge. "He's a real good guy, always knows how to take care of people. You'd like him." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, hoping the conversation would end there. But the driver kept talking, his words tumbling out faster and faster, as if he couldn't stop himself. "Yeah, Carlos is the kind of guy who can get you anything you need," he continued, his voice growing more animated. "Money, a place to stay, whatever. He's got connections, you know. Real powerful connections." I nodded again, my unease growing with every word. There was something wrong with this man, something deeply unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a terrible mistake by getting into his van. As we continued down the road, the driver's ramblings grew more and more incoherent. He talked about Carlos, about deals gone wrong, about people who had crossed him and paid the price. His words were disjointed, his sentences trailing off into mutters and half-finished thoughts. But there was a thread of something dark running through his ramblings, a sense of danger that made my skin crawl. I glanced out the window, hoping to see something familiar, something that would tell me we were close to my destination. But the landscape was unfamiliar, the desert stretching out endlessly in all directions, and I realized with a sinking feeling that we were far from where I needed to be. "Hey, where are we?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The driver didn't answer right away. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "We're taking a shortcut," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Don't worry, we'll get there," but the tone of his voice sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a shortcut. This was a detour into the unknown, and I had no idea where we were headed or what this man had planned. I glanced around the van, searching for anything that could help me if things took a turn for the worse. My eyes landed on a small screwdriver sticking out of the door compartment, and I quickly grabbed it, slipping it into my jacket pocket. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As we drove deeper into the desert, the driver's demeanor grew more erratic. He started muttering to himself, his hands twitching on the steering wheel. His eyes were wild, darting around as if he was searching for someone. The sense of dread in the pit of my stomach grew stronger with every passing second. And then, without warning, the van veered off the road onto a dirt path that cut through the desert. The sudden change in direction caught me off guard, and I was thrown against the door as the van jolted over the rough terrain. "Hey, where are we going?" I asked, my voice edged with panic. The driver didn't answer. He just kept driving, his grip on the steering wheel tightening, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed his gaze and saw a small isolated house at the end of the dirt road. The house was a ramshackle structure, its paint peeling and its windows dark. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. Something about the house felt wrong, like it was a place where bad things happened. "Why are we stopping here?" I asked, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. The driver didn't respond. He just pulled the van to a stop in front of the house, killed the engine, and sat there in silence. The only sound was the creak of the cooling engine and the distant howl of the wind. My heart pounded in my chest as I gripped the small screwdriver in my pocket, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. "You need to meet Carlos," the driver finally said, his voice eerily calm. "He's inside." He's been waiting for you." A cold wave of fear washed over me. I didn't know who this Carlos was, but I knew I didn't want to meet him. I glanced at the door handle, my thoughts scrambling for a way out. The darkness outside felt like it was closing in, and the isolation of the desert only added to the terror. I had to get out of there, but every instinct told me that running might provoke the driver into doing something even more dangerous. "I really need to get home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "My mom's expecting me." The driver's face twisted into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, just cold, calculating malice. "You'll be fine," he said. "Carlos will take care of you." My hand tightened around the screwdriver as I considered my options. I could make a break for it, try to get out of the van and run, but the house was the only structure for miles, and the driver was between me and the open road. There was no telling what he or this Carlos character would do if I tried to flee. The driver opened his door and got out, walking around to my side of the van. The darkness seemed to swallow him as he moved, his figure barely visible in the dim light. My heart raced as he reached for my door handle, and I braced myself for what was about to happen. The door swung open, and the driver stood there, his silhouette a menacing shadow against the backdrop of the night. "Come on," he said, his voice low and insistent. "Carlos doesn't like to be kept waiting." I knew then that I had to act. I couldn't go into that house. I might never come out again. Without thinking, I lunged forward, shoving the screwdriver into the driver's side, aiming for anything that would give me a chance to escape. He let out a pained yell, stumbling back as I scrambled out of the van, my heart pounding in my ears. I hit the ground running, my feet kicking up dust as I sprinted toward the road. The desert stretched out before me, vast and empty, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from that house as possible. Behind me, I heard the driver cursing, but I didn't dare look back. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The night air was cold against my face as I ran, the stars above blurred by my tears of fear. The darkness around me seemed to press in on all sides, the landscape a disorienting blur of shadows and sand. My breath came in ragged gasps, my lungs burning as I pushed myself to keep going. But no matter how fast I ran, the sound of the van's engine roared back to life behind me. The driver had recovered, and he was coming after me. The headlights of the van cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead, and I could hear the tires skidding on the loose dirt as the van gained on me. Panic surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching with the effort. The road was still far off, but it was my only hope. If I could just reach it, maybe, just maybe, I could flag down another car, someone who could help me. But the van was getting closer, the engine a growl of impending doom. I could feel the vibrations of the tires through the ground, the rumble growing louder with each passing second. The driver wasn't going to let me go without a fight, and I knew I was running out of time. Then, as if by some miracle, I saw headlights in the distance. Another car was coming down the road. Hope flared in my chest, and I veered toward the road, waving my arms frantically, praying that they would see me. The car's headlights grew brighter, and I heard the sound of its engine approaching. But so did the van, and I knew I had only seconds to reach the road before the driver caught up to me. With a final burst of energy, I sprinted toward the road, my legs screaming in protest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The car was almost upon me, and I could see the driver's face, a look of confusion and concern as he spotted me in the darkness. I stumbled onto the road, nearly collapsing in front of the oncoming car. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car came to a halt just inches from where I stood. I pounded on the hood, yelling for help, my voice hoarse with fear. "Please, help me. He's trying to kill me," I screamed, my words tumbling out in a desperate rush. The driver of the car, a middle-aged man with wide eyes and a look of shock, quickly unlocked the doors and gestured for me to get in. I didn't hesitate. I threw open the passenger door and scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. As soon as I was inside, the driver hit the gas, the car lurching forward as we sped down the road, leaving the red van and its driver in the dust. I looked back, expecting the van to follow, but it didn't. It just sat there in the middle of the road, its headlights glaring like the eyes of a predator watching its prey escape. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the roar of the engine and the pounding of my heart. The driver glanced over at me, his expression a mix of concern and disbelief. "Are you okay? What the hell happened back there?" he asked, his voice shaky. I didn't know where to begin. The events of the past hour felt like a nightmare, something too surreal to be real. But as I tried to explain, the words caught in my throat, the fear and adrenaline still coursing through me. I don't know, I finally managed to say. "That guy. He tried to take me to that house. I think he was going to kill me." The driver shook his head, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Jesus, you're lucky I came along when I did. Who knows what that psycho would have done to you?" We drove in silence for a while, the car's headlights cutting through the darkness as we left the desert behind. The terror of the night slowly began to fade, replaced by a numb exhaustion that seeped into my bones. I didn't know where we were going, but I didn't care, as long as it was far away from that house, from that van, and from the man who had tried to take me there. Eventually, the driver dropped me off at a gas station on the edge of town. He offered to take me to the police, but I refused. I was too shaken, too tired to deal with the questions, the paperwork, the explanations. All I wanted was to go home, to crawl into bed and forget that any of this had ever happened. I thanked him and watched as he drove off into the night, leaving me alone in the flickering light of the gas station. The world felt different now, darker, more dangerous. The fear that had gripped me on that dirt road hadn't fully left, and I knew it never would. When I finally made it home, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not my mom, not my girlfriend, not my friends. I kept the terror of that night locked inside, a secret I carried with me wherever I went. The small screwdriver I had grabbed from the van remained in my pocket, a cold, hard reminder of how close I had come to something unspeakable. I never hitchhiked again. The desert, once a place of quiet solitude, now felt like a vast empty expanse where danger lurked in every shadow. The walk home that night had changed me, left a mark on my soul that would never fully heal. And sometimes when the wind howls through the canyons or the night grows too quiet, I can still hear the growl of that van's engine, the echo of a nightmare that refuses to be forgotten. Story 3: The Last Sleepover. There's something about the last sleepover you have as a child that stays with you. For most, it's a memory of laughter, whispered secrets, and staying up late with friends. For me, that last sleepover was something different, something much darker. It's a memory that I've tried to bury for years, but no matter how deep I push it down, it always finds its way back to the surface. I was 12 years old when I had what I believe was the last sleepover of my life. It was at my friend Nick's grandma's house, an old, creaky place that seemed to be stuck in a different era. The house sat on the edge of a small town, bordered by a dense patch of woods that led to a park. I'd been to Nick's grandma's house a few times before, but I'd never stayed the night. Looking back now, there was something off about that house, something I didn't notice then, but would come to understand all too well later. The house itself was a relic of the past, a Victorian-style structure with peeling paint and ivy that clung to its walls like it was trying to pull the house back into the earth. The windows were large and gave the impression of eyes watching you as you approached. Inside, the floors creaked with every step, and the walls were lined with old portraits of stern-looking ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you stood. It was the kind of house that was charming in the daylight, but took on a much more sinister tone once the sun went down. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the leaves crunched underfoot, and the air smelled of wood smoke and the promise of winter. Nick and I had spent the day playing in the park behind his grandma's house, running through the trees and playing hide and seek until the sun began to dip below the horizon. The park was one of those places that seemed innocent enough during the day, but was full of shadows and hidden corners that made your imagination run wild after dark. As the shadows lengthened, Nick's grandma called us back inside for dinner. The house, which had seemed so inviting in the daylight, now cast long, eerie shadows that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The old oak trees around the house swayed gently in the wind, their branches scratching against the windows like long fingers trying to get inside. We ate dinner linguine with clam sauce, a dish that seemed oddly sophisticated for a couple of 12-year-olds, and then, after much pleading, convinced Nick's grandma to let us go back outside to play flashlight tag. The backyard, which opened directly into the park, was the perfect place for such a game, and we quickly donned our jackets and grabbed our flashlights. The rules were simple. One of us would be it and would count to 30 while the other hid somewhere in the yard or just inside the park's boundaries. Then the seeker would use the flashlight to find the hider, and if the beam of light caught them, they were tagged. We played for what felt like hours, the excitement of the game mixing with the thrill of being out in the dark, the cold air stinging our cheeks as we ran. As the game wore on, the night grew colder, and the park became darker. The moon, which had been shining brightly when we started, was now hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the world in near total darkness. The only light came from our flashlights, which cut through the blackness in narrow beams, revealing only small glimpses of the world around us. It was my turn to be it, so I counted to 30, my eyes squeezed shut as I tried to ignore the sounds of Nick's footsteps crunching on the leaves. When I reached 30, I opened my eyes and turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The yard was empty, the trees at the edge of the park casting long, skeletal shadows. I began to search, checking the usual spots behind the shed, under the picnic table, around the large oak tree that stood sentinel in the middle of the yard. As I swept the flashlight across the yard, I heard a faint rustling in the trees, followed by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. I turned toward the noise, shining the light into the woods, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was Nick, trying to scare me. There, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure draped in what looked like a giant sheet. It was tall, much taller than Nick, and the sheet hung loosely over its body, obscuring its features. I could see 2 holes cut out for eyes, and a smaller hole for a mouth, but there was nothing behind those holes, just darkness. "Nick, is that you?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. But deep down, I knew it wasn't Nick. There was no way he could have found a sheet that size, and the figure was too tall, too menacing. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me through the eye holes, its presence radiating a malevolent energy that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I heard the sound of footsteps running toward me. I turned, expecting to see the figure rushing at me, but instead, it was Nick, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Run," he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the house. "Run inside now." We bolted for the back door, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as we ran. I could hear the figure moving behind us, its footsteps heavy and deliberate, the sound growing louder with each passing second. We reached the door, threw it open, and slammed it shut behind us, locking it with shaking hands. Nick's grandma was sitting in the living room, knitting quietly, oblivious to the terror we had just experienced. We tried to explain what had happened, our words tumbling out in a frantic rush, but she just smiled and patted us on the heads, telling us that it was probably just our imaginations. But I knew what I had seen, and so did Nick. That night, we didn't dare go back outside. Instead, we stayed in the spare bedroom downstairs, lying in our twin beds, talking in hushed whispers about the figure in the woods. The room was cold, and even with the blankets pulled up to my chin, I couldn't stop shivering. As we lay there, the events of the night replayed in my mind over and over again. The figure in the sheet had been too real, too solid to be just a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something terrible, something that still lurked just outside the house, waiting for its chance to strike. Sometime around midnight, just as we were starting to drift off to sleep, we heard a soft thumping sound coming from upstairs. Nick and I looked at each other, our eyes wide with fear. The sound was rhythmic, like something or someone was walking around on the floor above us. "Do you think it's your grandma?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Nick shook his head. "She's a heavy sleeper. She wouldn't be up this late." We lay there in silence, listening as the thumping grew louder, closer. It was moving down the stairs, one slow, deliberate step at a time. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I wanted to get up, to run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The footsteps stopped just outside our door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence that pressed down on us like a weight. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The door creaked open, just a crack, and through the small gap, I could see at the edge of the sheet, dragging along the floor. The figure had followed us inside. Nick grabbed my arm, squeezing it so hard it hurt, and I could feel him shaking. We were both too terrified to move, too scared to even scream. The door continued to inch open, and then, just as I thought I was going to die from sheer terror, the figure stopped. For what felt like an eternity, it stood there, the sheet billowing slightly, as if in a breeze that didn't exist. Then, as slowly as it had opened, the door began to close. The footsteps retreated, growing fainter and fainter, until they disappeared altogether. Nick and I didn't move for the rest of the night. We stayed in our beds, wide awake, staring at the door, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. The next morning, we finally found the courage to get up. The house was quiet, filled with the soft morning light that filtered through the curtains. It was hard to believe that the events of the previous night had been real, that we had been stalked by something not of this world. Nick's grandma was in the kitchen, making breakfast, and she greeted us with a warm smile as we walked in. We didn't tell her about the figure that had come to our door. We knew she wouldn't believe us. Instead, we just ate our pancakes in silence, the events of the night before hanging over us like a dark cloud. After breakfast, Nick's grandma asked us to help her with something upstairs. Reluctantly, we followed her up the creaky wooden staircase, our hearts heavy with dread. She led us to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall, the one we hadn't dared go near during the night. The door was open, and as we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the open window. The curtains fluttered in the breeze, and the room was colder than it should have been. Nick's grandma frowned as she walked over to the window, pulling it shut. "Which one of you boys opened this?" she asked, her tone stern. Nick and I exchanged a glance, both of us shaking our heads. "We didn't open it," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't believe us. She pointed to the bed, where something white and crumpled lay in a heap. "And what's this doing here?" We walked over to the bed, our blood running cold as we realized what it was. It was the same sheet that the figure in the woods had been wearing. It was dirty and crumpled, with 3 holes cut out for eyes, 1 for a mouth. Nick's grandma picked it up, her expression turning from stern to horrified as she held it up for us to see. "This wasn't here yesterday," she said, her voice trembling. Neither of us could speak. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the walls pressing in, the air growing colder by the second. We stared at the sheet, the same one that had stalked us through the woods, that had come to our door in the middle of the night. Without another word, Nick's grandma dropped the sheet, grabbed us by the arms, and hurried us out of the house. We didn't go back inside that day. Instead, we went to a neighbor's house, where she called the police. When the police arrived, they searched the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. It was as if the figure had never existed, as if it had been a figment of our imagination. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. As we waited for the police to finish their search, I noticed something strange. The entire time we were outside, I had felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just the normal unease that comes from being in a creepy situation. It was a palpable sense of something or someone watching us from the shadows. I kept glancing around, expecting to see the figure lurking just out of sight, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling persisted, and I couldn't shake the sense that we were not alone. The police eventually left, finding no evidence of an intruder. Nick's grandma seemed relieved, but I could tell that she was still shaken. She insisted that we stay at the neighbor's house for the rest of the day, and we didn't argue. Nick and I spent the afternoon in a daze, trying to process what had happened. Neither of us spoke much, the fear from the previous night still hanging over us like a dark cloud. That evening, when Nick's parents came to pick us up, we told them everything. They were skeptical at first, but the look of genuine terror on our faces convinced them that something had happened. They decided that Nick wouldn't be staying at his grandma's house anymore, at least not for a while. We all agreed that it was for the best. As we drove away from the house, I couldn't help but glance back one last time. The house stood there, dark and silent, its windows reflecting the fading light of the day. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone, and I told myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. That figure, whatever it was, wasn't bound by the walls of the house. It was something much older, much darker, and much more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. And it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. Nick and I never spoke about that night again. We both moved on with our lives, but the memory of that last sleepover stayed with us. I never spent the night at Nick's grandma's house again. In fact, I never had another sleepover after that. The experience left a scar on my soul, a deep, lingering fear that I carry with me to this day. Years later, when I was in college, I ran into Nick at a party. We hadn't seen each other in years, but it was like no time had passed. We spent the evening catching up, reminiscing about old times, and eventually, the conversation turned to that night at his grandma's house. At first, we laughed it off, chalking it up to our overactive imaginations. But as the night wore on and the drinks flowed, Nick's expression grew serious. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. "You know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I never told you this, but a few weeks after that night, my grandma passed away. They said it was natural causes, but I don't know." I always had this feeling that it had something to do with that figure we saw. I felt a chill run down my spine as Nick spoke. I hadn't thought about that night in years, but hearing him talk about it brought all the old fears rushing back. The figure in the sheet, the feeling of being watched, the sense that something evil was lurking just out of sight, it all came flooding back, as vivid as the night it happened. Nick and I didn't talk much after that. We went our separate ways, and the memory of that night slowly faded into the background of our lives. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear those footsteps, the slow, deliberate thump of something moving just out of sight. And every time, I remember that night and the figure in the sheet that came to our door. Some things, it seems, are better left forgotten. But try as I might, I can't forget that night, that sleepover, that moment when I realized that the monsters under the bed might be real after all. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.